Hello, everyone, and welcome to 99 Questions, a series of dialogues, podcasts, workshops, and residencies hosted by the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. My name is Sammy Blassingame, and I'll be moderating this evening as we explore what could be a new era of ethics and museums. Tonight's event is the culmination of an exchange that took place over the last month between students enrolled in the Honors and Curatorship program run by the Center for Curating the Archive at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and a group of students, PhDs, and museum professionals from the Museology and Heritage program at the Federal University of the State of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Over the course of 3 internal workshops, I've had the pleasure to facilitate this exchange and support the participants as they embraced vulnerabilities, asked hard questions, and learned from one another to expand their understanding of what it means to be a curator in today's world. As a researcher and facilitator in the field of environmental policy, my work often incorporates a lens of decolonial environmental justice, while inspiring collective imaginations toward how we, as a global society, choose to live and coexist with one another. So for me, it's been an honor to get to know the participants of this exchange and learn along with them the various ways in which ethics forms our collective experience in and beyond museums. Throughout tonight's event, we welcome you to engage with us as much as possible. And that can be either through questions or by sharing constructive or critical comments. So you can do that through a tool called BoxR, which for those of you who have not used this tool before, don't worry, it's quite simple. You'll just need to copy the URL that you should be seeing now at the bottom of your screens. And you can use that in a new web page on your browser or open it up on your mobile phones. Another option is to access it via the event page on the Humboldt Forum website. Just click on Join the Discussion. Once you've opened this tool, you simply type in your question in the text box and press enter. And after that, you will be able to see all the other questions that have been submitted, and you'll be able to vote for the ones that you like the most. So yeah, the top 5 will show up to me, and I'll be able to ask them to our speakers this evening. On that note, another tiny point about the tech behind this event is that not only are the participants joining from their own individual computers in South Africa and Brazil, I normally am based in Berlin, but I'm currently in the US. And Michael, who you'll hear from in just a moment, is actually in Buenos Aires. So we're quite an international group this evening. So I want to give a big shout out to our tech team, who is sitting, of course, in Berlin at the Humboldt Forum, for all the work they're doing behind the scenes to make our event run smoothly this evening. Great. So with logistics sorted, I welcome you again to our event tonight. And to start us off, I'd like to introduce Michael Dieminga, the curator of 99 Questions, to say a few words about how this exchange came to be. Michael, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Sammy. Yeah, thank you. Like as some of you probably know already, 99 Questions is a project which aims to look how via curatorial or artistic approaches a social practice in museums for dealing with the colonial impacts in the past and the present is possible in a sense. In this sense, 99 Questions is foremost for asking questions and for listening. And listening as a practice to be responsive, to relate to each other. So to ask questions on difference, to create relations in diversity in forms of epistemologies and knowledges and understanding of histories and concept of arts and heritage. However, a curatorial practice maybe goes far beyond this. To curate means to have a kind of responsibility of urgent social questions. So it is always also about a social political relevance to create. Sorry. Museums and the curator is not just about the conservation of objects, about scientific and academia questions. is about sharing emotions, about desires, about talking about vulnerabilities to make our relations also visible. Museums, in this sense, should be places for inspiring each other and learning from each other, places where we can learn from and within a multiplicity. So this is the second year of this kind of exchange. Dwayne Hethrow, who will be talking after me and introduce himself a little bit, and I've started thinking about it. And we started with the idea of a school. We called it the School of Transnational Curatorship. That's a big term in a sense. But the idea of the school was about, of mutual learning. So last year we had already a small exchange where students also from the Cape Town University had a seminar together with two curators from the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, which is part of the Humboldt Forum. This year, we joined forces with the lovely colleagues from the Universidade Federal do Estado de Rio de Janeiro, and with my colleague Thais Mayumi, which I'm now working since 2 years together. So the idea about this workshop and this dialogue now was about creating a space for exchange, an open space for questions in the sense. The idea of a school is intended to create a meshwork of bonds, open and in a flux, but always in relation. It is about talking about the different parameters and giving space to different ethical questions in forms of curatorial hospitality. The concept of curatorial hospitality has also been seen critically because it defines a host and a guest. And sometimes it always keeps people as in the role of guests. So they are tolerated but not accepted. This question is raised in a museum dealing with coloniality is a big question. How can museums be hospitality in this sense? Are the objects in museums just guests? In 99 Questions, we want to use the concept of hospitality as a tool for openness, to give space, to share resources, and for joint learning. By giving space, commitments are made which manifest in exchange and in possible answers and how to relate to each other. Transformation is a constant but slow process. Only by re-evaluating our relations and commitments, a constant transformation can take place. I really hope to have more exchanges like this in the next years, as just so many interesting thoughts are just in the beginning to emerge. I want to say thank you to other people involved in the realization of this, for their trust, for their sharing their knowledge and their thoughts, and for making this possible. Now I'm happy to handing over to Dwayne Hethrow, who is a junior research fellow at the Center for Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town. His expertise lies in the analysis of the curatorial construction of heritage and contested public cultures. Dwayne?
Thank you, Michael. My name is Dwayne Jethro. I am a junior research fellow at the Center for Curating the Archive, which is based in the Michaelis School of Fine Art at the University of Cape Town. The Center for Curating the Archive works actively with many different kinds of collections, developing curatorship as a creative site of knowledge and knowledge production. Projects, publications, and courses aim through practice to open up novel combinations of the historically separated domains of the creative arts and the truth-claiming discourses of history and the social and cultural sciences. Since 2014, the Honours in Curatorship program is offered in close collaboration with Ezekiel Museums in South Africa. It offers courses in the theory and the practice of curatorship, developing in students sophisticated awareness of the practicalities, politics, and poetics of working with collections of many kinds. This workshop and talk builds on a smaller workshop, as Michael mentioned, with Michael and colleagues that engage with the question of invitations and participation, where the 2021 Honours in Curatorship class participated in thinking through the challenges of being invited and working with large cultural and heritage institutions and the ethical dilemmas they bring. This year, we are fortunate to collaborate with our colleagues from the Federal University of the State of Rio de Janeiro, and we're really fortunate for that. And at this point, I also want to give a big shout out to Claire Butcher, one of the facilitators of our 2022 class, who's also been pivotal in this set of workshops. So on to the question of the new. The new and transnational ethics are dominant current themes in Western European museum debates at the moment. Histories of European colonial projects, claims to ownership and conditions of possession of object collections held in museums, and the restitution of objects and human remains are topics that have rightly gained increasing public attention. They are linked to the important literature by, among others, Felwine Sarr and Benedicte Savoy, Dan Hicks and his text British Museums, as well as the South African historian Siraj Rasool and his theories about the museum as a process, restitution as African-centric, and as something that is only a starting point for a new set of transnational relations between communities located in Africa and museums in the global north. But our discussion takes place on a different plane and in a different register. It is instead informed by Janet Marstein's presentation and subsequent discussion with Wandile Kasebe and Macarena Gomez Barres, who discussed practices and principles of a relational ethics for museums in the 99 question series of dialogues. There, Marstein noted how passive, reactive, and largely ungeneralizable international council codes are in museum settings today. Instead, she proposed a relational curatorial ethics that are dynamic and culturally specific and directed towards structuring inclusive, empathic relationships between people, objects, and institutions. So, to somehow disappoint our audience a little bit, we eschew the new, so to say, and disavow coming up with grand insights and solutions and generalizable ways forward. Arguably, the new is as much a construction of current museum debates, a suggestion that fresh truths expounded by experts can lead us out of the knotted, historically entrenched structural problems museums face today. Instead, as you will see in the discussion that unfolds, our students have more urgent and pressing local ethical dilemmas to contend with that challenge them to find relational curatorial strategies to negotiate in the context of the everyday. Our conversation is local, small scale, and reflective of the conditions of curatorship in the South African and Brazilian contexts, as seen through the eyes of budding practitioners entering the field. It is a reflection of ethical dilemmas that challenge them in the ordinary day-to-day work of being a curator, which is not addressed in dominant museology debates. And it is about the surprising similarities and differences in curatorial approaches and perspectives employed in negotiating these dilemmas. Some would argue that Global South participants in a debate within the umbrella of the Humboldt Forum's public education programming is in itself an ethical dilemma. Indeed, the institution has been vociferously criticized, and I've participated in some of this criticism myself. Much work around questions of structural change, repatriation of objects, and restitution still needs to occur. Yet they have struck up a set of dialogues that critical, informative debate. We reject having our voices appropriated and co-opted and refuse the seduction of the new, but embrace the platform to triangulate a discussion between Germany, South Africa, and Brazil, which in the workshop has been inspiring, informative, and enriching. In what follows, we hope that you get a grasp of our respective emergent curatorial practice, our global South research contexts, and an on-the-ground perspective of the challenges new curators and museologists face in their day-to-day work. Now, I would like to introduce my colleague from Brazil, Amanda Cavalcanti from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Duane, for introducing our context and mentioning some questions that connects all of us. So since you did a very nice speech about it, I would like to mention more specifically the context of the Museology and Heritage program that the Rio participants come from. This is a program of Unirio, the Federal University of the State of Rio de Janeiro, in collaboration with MAST, the Museum of Astronomy and Related Sciences, and it is a high-level professional training program that promotes master's and doctorate degrees, focused on qualification of professionals for teaching, research, and innovation. The course is dedicated to museologists and professionals from all areas of knowledge who work in museums and institutions dedicated to research, documentation, protection, and the diffusion of heritage. And it is a pioneering program in Brazil because it is the first master's and doctoral course in museology in South America. And talking a little about the current Brazilian context, it is important to mention that we are going through a moment in which the cultural area is politically undervalued in our country. So working with museums and other cultural institutions is hard. It's an act of love, of resistance. So in this challenging moment, being able to create connections with other students and professionals who are also passionate about what they do, willing to think about heritage, to think about museums and how to make them more socially relevant spaces, inclusive, give us the strength to keep working for what we believe in together. So it was very exciting to collaborate with our colleagues from Cape Town and the ones from Berlin as well. And I hope today we can share with our audience the results of this partnership. Thank you. And now I give the mic back to Sammy.
Thank you so much. Thank you both, Dwayne and Amanda, for setting a bit of the context, giving some insight into the programs the participants from both countries are coming from, and for also outlining some of the boundaries that our process took place in. I thought that was very, very important and insightful. Thank you. So moving on, the rest of the event tonight will give you more insight into what this exchange looked like. First, we'd like to hear from both groups on some ethical dilemmas facing them in their current local context or country context. And then we'll go into more of a dialogue between the two participants, sharing some learnings and reflections on the process and what it can look like moving forward. As I said before, our exchange took place over 3 internal workshops. And that's not so much time, but we were able to dive into what the realities are for both groups in our second session when we shared some ethical dilemmas with each other. And so to give some insight into that, I'd like to introduce 2 participants from each country that will present an ethical dilemma that is quite pressing for their context. And we will start with the Rio group. So I'd like to welcome back Amanda, along with her colleague Nilo Almeida, who will now present the context from Rio. Afterwards, there will be some questions. So floor is yours.
Thank you, Sammy. Hello to everyone watching. It's such a pleasure to be here. So today we want to talk about the curator's job between being and being able to do, and discuss what are the limits of action that curators face in museums, and to bring dialogue and challenging relationships as part of the construction of the colonized narratives in museums. Next slide, please. Our starting point is a case that happened in MASP this year. The MASP, the Museu de Arte de São Paulo, Assis Chateaubriand, in English, São Paulo Art Museum, was conceived in the 1940s by the Brazilian entrepreneur in the communication sector, Assis Chateaubriand, who invited the Italian art critic Pietro Maria Bardi to form the collection and manage the museum, and also Lina Bobardi to conceive the architecture and the exhibition design, which has become a landmark in the history of 20th century architecture and typography. And in the beginning, its collection was composed largely of works of European and Brazilian art. But nowadays, there is a movement to include works of indigenous and African art made mainly by women artists. So MASP's holding currently consists of more than 11,000 artworks, including paintings, sculptures, objects, photographs, videos, pieces of clothing from various periods from Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. And it is considered one of the most important museums in Brazil and Latin America. Next slide, please. One of the main approaches recently proposed by the museum is to bring visibility to audience without visibility and to discuss the decolonial issue. The museum elaborated a new mission for the institution in 2017 that declared the MASP as a diverse, inclusive, and plural museum. For example, in 2018, the museum exhibited a retrospective of the Black Brazilian artist Maria Auxiliadora as a way of presenting the culture of the non-dominant classes in the museum through art. At the end of 2019, the anthropologist Sandra Benitez was invited to act as assistant curator of the institution, being the first indigenous curator to perform this role at the museum. This was largely communicated in the press, even on international media, as an important act to guarantee a more inclusive space. Next slide, please. Recently, the Brazilian media brought the museum back to spotlight to report that the exhibition Histórias Brasileiras, in English, Brazilian Stories or Brazilian Histories, in Portuguese, Histórias can mean both, created by Sandra Benitez and other curators of MASP, that was scheduled to open in July 2022, had six photographs selected by her as a curator that was not included in the exhibition by the museum. So unable to continue with the exhibition as they had planned, Sandra Benitez and Clarissa Diniz, another curator involved in the Retomadas, a curatorial access about social movements that prioritize recovering their rights, resigns from the institution. The museum says that the reason of not including the pictures was a bureaucratic one. The time to request loans for the works on the pictures would not be sufficient. But since the pictures had a political and social aspect, we reflect on the impact of taking it off of the exhibition. The pictures represented the landless workers' movement, a movement that divides opinions in Brazil, seen by a part of the population as revolutionary and apart from the established order, and by the other part of the population as a group with legitimate questions, like the agrarian reform in Brazil. Next slide, please. So when we reflected on this recent case, it has brought to our mind some questions that help us think about the role of curators in museums and the challenges they face when exercising their activities, their power. One thing that our group discussed a lot was the power of museums. That is the theme of this year's International Museum Day by ICOM. And we discussed the power of curators as well. That in their activities, they can make important choices like what should be communicated, what should be silenced, that can directly affect other people. But at the same time, there are questions about the limits of a curator's performance, since this person is constantly just one within a set of different agents with different interests within an institution. And of course, we discussed about the internal structures that curators find in institutions and that often create barriers in their work, many times bureaucratic barriers that are difficult to overcome if you are acting alone. And the other topic we discussed was the urge of including different voices in curatorial processes. What is extremely relevant nowadays if you want to create decolonized narratives. But changing these power structures is very difficult because it often means giving up absolute power to allow the creation of more horizontal processes on the same eye level with others. So we remain with the question how to ensure multiple voices in a work with multiple curators and multiple interests. Nilo, I'll give the mic to you.
Nilo, can you hear us? The mic is yours.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me? Are you listening fine?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Just a brief welcome. So, keeping the presentation, as Amanda was talking, the next slide, please. It's a general questions that case evokes. What is the effective autonomy of the curator and how to ensure multiple voices now work with multiple curators? When you think about MASP as a, how can I say, big museum, we can use the same idea for all kinds and types and shapes of museums because you have actually this diversity of gender, ethnicity, and how can you embrace and keep everybody talking together, mostly as curators. So next slide. Please, do that. So if you have the challenging relationships as a center of.
Sorry, it's the one back. Slide back, please. Oh, thank you.
No, I can't see it's not showing to me, sorry. So it's the challenging relationships we have to face between society as curators with institutions and sponsors. So how can we do that? So the next slide is facing challenging relationships. Dialogue, strongest way we can face. So, and how can we do that? First, reconciling interests or the interests of different agents must be presented with transparency from the very beginning, because depending on the institution where you work or are you working with, what's the mission? How do they deal with some topics, like the colonial topics, for example? It's not a matter, but it's mostly based on not how we deal with that and how the institution deal with that and talk about it. Institutional culture, it's necessary to join forces to change internal barriers in the institutions. As I said before, them has their own values and beliefs. So always understand so dialogical process take longer to implement. So the relationship may be created. This must be negotiated. So we must work with time, patience, and resilience, working in a everyday basis. talking, listening, being ready to the acceptance to the other's opinions. And most of all, be open. It's important to implement measures to listen to different groups of the population, as well as implementing changes if necessary. So we must be able to celebrate and embrace the diversity of audiences and public, and being able to talk about it with, if you think about it's a private institution with the board, or a public institution with the people who support, or agencies who support institution, which is bringing everybody together. So the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Are you listening to me?
Yes, we had some problem with connection, but now I can hear you.
Okay. Okay. So every curatorial decision is an ethical decision. So I think most of all nowadays, curators must face not only their decisions which are important with the exhibitions and the collections, but how these decisions affected the public and audiences, and how can they be able to work as a say use the image of a round table, bring everybody in
Neil, I'm sorry, we're having problem with your connection. So would you mind if I finish the presentation?
Sure.
Okay, so sorry, because I'm sure you had a lot to discuss and to put into the presentation, but since we are having problems, I'll just finish and present that, yeah, we believe that dialogues on a roundtable, which means at the same eye level, with different agents that contribute in the institutions. With that, we say also participants from the society and from different social groups that are all often marginalized from these curatorial processes is the best way for getting better scenarios in the future. And that's the finish of our presentation. The next slide, please. Here you find the names of all the participants from the Rio group. And we thank you for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you so much. So sorry about the technical internet difficulties, but that is what happens when we're doing online exchanges like this, a very normal process. We experienced it also in our exchange, of course. And I think it speaks also to what Nilo was saying about the time it takes to give to these sort of processes. You know, a lot of us had a lot of patience in making sure we could meet each other and talk. And that's something that's really important as we try to deal with some of these dilemmas that we're facing. I want to check quickly the VoxR tool and remind all of the audience members, everyone watching, that you're welcome to pose questions there, should you have any. But maybe one question from my side for the two of you. These 4 steps that you mentioned about being open and having time, and now I didn't write down the other 2, but where do those come from? Are those something that are standardized somewhere, that are something that a lot of people are talking about implementing in some way, or can you say more about where those come from?
So it came from all the discussions we made in this, the 3 sessions here, the reflections we were making after the three sessions we have together, and also the reflections that this case in particular from MASP evokes on us, since the problem with time, when the institution says they have time for the long requests, and it wasn't that necessary to bring these works that was after put it aside, problems with the internal structures we find in institutions, and these bureaucratic barriers, the reflections on the difficulties we have on trying to hear people, hear the society in different social groups that we often don't hear, and also the problems we have when to how can I say, to put in practice everything we hear from them, because it's easier to hear. We know we have a lot. It's very challenging to hear, but to hear it's a little bit easier to implement what these social groups are asking us to do and what they want to see differently in our institutions. So yeah, we have to be open. And the first one I just forgot. I don't know if Nilo remembers. I forgot. But yeah, it comes from the discussions we made together, and also from this particular case of MASP.
Reconciling interests.
Oh, yeah. That's something that came from all the dilemmas we discussed together in this 1989 question partnership. Always considering and reconciliating different interests is something very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think people think of it as difficult, but really it is the time and the effort that goes into it. Not that it's difficult in itself, I think. And maybe that's a good way and learning for us to think about and frame it as we move forward, that it's not so difficult, it just takes more time and effort, which some people find difficult maybe.
Yeah, and the thing we put on the slide, that's transparency. Like, I think everyone that works together has to be very open about the interests as a person, as a professional, as an institution. What are the interests that we put on the table? And yeah, with transparency, we can face it in a more dynamic way, I think.
Amazing. I have another question, but there will be time in the dialogue that follows to reflect more on these dilemmas as a whole. So I'll save it for that. Thank you both, Amanda and Nilo, for sharing this dilemma from the context of Brazil and Rio. So then we will move on also to our participants from South Africa. So now, from the other side, please welcome Vani Beloyi and Seth Krieger from the University of Cape Town. Vani and Seth, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sammy. And hello, everyone. Thank you, Amanda and Nilo. It was a very fascinating ethical dilemma. And I think from our conversations, we definitely got to weave through the similarities and differences when it comes to the locality of our dilemmas. Today, I will be presenting on behalf of our Cape Town colleagues and talking about the controversial collection. And once I'm done, my colleague Seth Krieger will be just reflecting a bit further on our dilemma. So yes, how should museums exhibit the problematic and violent? So a question that has stumped many critics, collectors, and artists at large, and myself at times, is whether an artist can be separated from their body of work. Although complex arguments have arisen from this inquiry in recent times, with the focus on gender-based violence, racism, xenophobia, and patriarchy, activists and marginalized groups have highlighted the need for work of artists to be interrogated alongside the character and acts of the individual who created them. Next slide, please. So the ethical dilemma that I would like to highlight is that of collections, and specifically that of Ezekiel South African National Gallery, located here in Cape Town, who have exhibited works by artists such as Zwelethu Mthethwa, who is convicted of murder of a sex worker, Nokupila Khumalo, in Cape Town, South Africa, 2017. This inquiry will highlight the history of apartheid in South Africa that has led to collections that are problematic in their own right, and how this has persisted in recent times with the scourge of gender-based violence. I'd also like to look into curatorial practices of museums like Ezekiel when dealing with controversial collections, and whether there's any certain ways that works like these can be exhibited ethically and with practices of care in mind. Next slide, please. So popularly known as one of the most well-known figures in modernist art in South Africa, Irma Stern has rightfully shaped the identity of South African art, especially in the apartheid era. Her ethnographic and anthropological depictions of people of color across Africa was perceived as somewhat progressive and radical for her time. But with the dawn of democracy and the end of apartheid, art historians began to critically look at the individual alongside the art that individual creates. Stern, although proclaimed herself as apolitical at a time of violent segregation and oppression of people of color, was known to hold conservative values when it came to the realities of her country. However, this did not end with her personal life, as a large critique of her work is that she rarely ever named her sitting subjects of color, reducing them to either a region they presided or a defining characteristic within the painting. As one of the most collected South African artists in art history, it would be naive to think that her work should be relegated to musty archives and never shown. However, I do think that there tends to be a lack of acknowledgement in the problematics that exist concerning her work and her discriminatory outlook on racial tensions within South Africa, and how galleries and museums approach exhibiting her work. An example of this is at the Novel Foundation in South Africa. They are currently showing a series of works created by Irma Stern during her travels of Zanzibar, with a similar theme of detachment from her sitters, yet no acknowledgement from the curators of the problematics in this, despite a growing need to critically engage with colonial archives. I believe this to be an appropriate point of departure in discussing the aesthetics and ethics of dealing with collections such as Zwelethu Mthethwa in an age of violence, discrimination, and marginalization. Next slide, please. Although apartheid, which saw the violent oppression of millions of Black South Africans, ended over 2 decades ago, the persistence of violence and racism, specifically towards women of color, still persists to this day. South Africa is known as the rape capital of the world, and 1 in 3 women experience gender-based violence in the country. In addition to this, another vulnerable group is the labor force of workers, who, similar to other countries in the world, is criminalized. This leaves them vulnerable to unlawful arrest, violence, and rape. With such a grim reality, advocacy and activism for such marginalized groups becomes that much more critical, as lack of visibility of these issues allows the violence to persist. Next slide, please. So before delving into the ethical dilemma of Zwelethu Mthethwa's collection of works within museums, I will give a short biography just to point to the large influence the artist had locally and internationally. Mthethwa was born in 1960 in the coastal city of Durban in South Africa. He studied fine arts here at Michaelis School of Fine Arts before studying for his master's at the Rochester Technology of Arts in New York. His photography and paintings can be found in collections around the world, including Jarvis at the University of Pretoria and New Church Museum in Cape Town and the Scottish National Gallery. In 2013, Mthethwa brutally attacked 23-year-old sex worker Nokupila Khumalo, resulting in her untimely death. He was later convicted of the murder in 2016. The National Gallery exhibited works in 2016, the National Gallery exhibited works in the exhibition Our Lady. The exhibition's aims was to highlight the rampant epidemic of gender-based violence in South Africa, which made the inclusion of Mthethwa's works even more jarring. What is important to note was not the existence of these works, but the defense given by curators as to why they were exhibited. Curator Kirsty Cockrell explained that the inclusion of the works was to create dialogue surrounding these issues. However, the sentiments of advocacy groups such as Sweat seemed apt as they remarked that the exhibition and showing of his works has in fact served to prioritize the notoriety of the accused rather than to respect the victim, and suggested replacing Mthethwa's works with a portrait of Khumalo, which you can see to your right, which in the end did occur. It can be understood that the inclusion of controversial works in museums could be a way to spark further conversation, as I do believe that spaces like museums lend themselves to be open spaces to question and unpack rather than purely safe spaces to protect and ignore. However, there has to be an ethical sensibility implemented when decisions such as these are made, especially in this case where the trial was in motion and the family and friends of the victim are still reeling from what has happened to their daughter, colleague, and friend. Curators and museums as institutions have an obligation to the public to be cognizant of this and exhibit with practices of care in mind, so as not to sanitize history, but acknowledge the trauma and not just those who have committed said trauma. Creating dialogue does not begin and end with hanging a painting, but calls for museums to acknowledge the violence that persists in showing such collections and point to ways in which artworks like these add value to combating issues they have highlighted in what has been exhibited. Thank you. And now I will be handing over to my colleague, Seth Krieger, just for further reflection.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Hi, everyone. So I'm kind of just be summing up and dealing with the prompts that were put forward within our ethical dilemma presentation that Bonnie put forward. And I've kind of summarized it into a set of questions and provocations that kind of come from that. So I think the first question that comes out within our dilemma is, can we separate art from the artist? So alongside the noted examples of Mthethwa, Stern, I even conjure up this question against the likes of Hitler's paintings. The question stands of how do we view art upon noting its relation to the artist? So someone that has spoken about this is scholar Arnold Brilliant, who dissects the dichotomy of perceived morality into two spheres of distinction. The first being the moral status of art objects, and the second being the artists themselves. Essentially, Brilliant puts forward the rationale that art and artists are both included within the conversation of morality, as they exist as a mutualistic relationship, a beholding of creator and creation. Essentially, this point then just saying how they both share weight within, I guess, where this dilemma stands. Okay, the next question that comes up is there an argument to be made for excluding histories? As Bonnie had mentioned about the work of Mthethwa being called to be removed from exhibitions due to his violent history and violent actions, it's essentially this question of, is that the way forward, to exclude these works from the canon that they exist within? I think a very fine point that was brought up was the example of Irma Stern, who still manages to be the leading figurehead for South African art. And I think within this conversation of when excluding, it's also then a question of where do we begin with that? Because as much as we can kind of seek to draw these lines now, how far back does one go? Especially, I bring this up, especially in relation to paintings that come from colonial and slave origins. And I think this point, or this conversation of drawing a line, is one that Dwayne had actually mentioned much earlier, is that within, I guess, this larger conversation of ethical dilemma, It's not necessarily about drawing a line. In our conversations with the Rio colleagues and with Sami, it came up that perhaps maybe not a line, but maybe a square or circle is another, something else that can be drawn. As ethical dilemmas are not merely a state of good versus evil that a line can actually be drawn between, but rather exist as relational models that depending on what it is. So the last kind of question and provocation that comes up is there a way forward? So essentially we're saying that, or essentially I'm asking is it not our purpose as curators or simply as individuals to promote a better future? We can't change the past as it has already happened, but through that, can one rewrite history? As curators, we have the space and possibility where we can change the narratives of the past in ways where ethics are seen and instances of justice, care, and restoration are honored. Within drawing this line, we are not drawing a line between two sides, but then rather drawing a line pointing towards a better future.
All right, thank you both for your input. I was trying to figure out what that sound is in the back that keeps happening. But
it's storming outside, so.
Oh, is that what it is?
Probably it's the rain.
Okay, but it didn't even sound like it was coming from you, and so I was just wondering, like someone unmuted or I don't know. So as I said before, we're joining from so many places. Technical difficulties are bound to happen, but thank you both. That was a great. What I was thinking as you were speaking was something we reflected on in the exchange, that after we heard some of these dilemmas during our second session, a lot of us felt like, okay, well, we need to let this sink in and digest all of this before we can talk about it. And so hearing it again and also, having that space was really important. You already answered posed some of the questions that I was also thinking of. But there is a question that maybe might fit from the Boxar tool. And it says, how can institutions, or should they, be publicizing their decisions when facing ethical dilemmas? And I wonder if you have a thought on that. Also in the context of Irma Stern, I wonder how often when she's talked about in public, it's equated with the problematics, because I understood that is a conversation on one side, but on the other side, she's championed for her work. How much is that a conversation together in the public in South Africa? To either of
you. Would it be possible to answer the first question and then the...
Sure.
Fine. Okay. I think in terms of, and as Amanda and Nilo were speaking, this idea of transparency, and I think institutions should have a sense of obligation in terms of publicizing and making known what is behind the decision, especially when it is around sensitive issues, such as in the case of Zwelethu Mthethwa. Why hang the piece? Why in that space, and in what way? I think is important. So I do think there is a certain obligation for transparency, and I think the public kind of does want that as well. Just speaking on my own behalf.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vonnie.
Yeah, I think this question of transparency and publicness kind of come into both questions in some way, because as curators or museologists, you are upkeeping and presenting one's archive or one's narrative or one's history. So there is this question of what narrative or what line or what argument are you essentially putting forward. So in the case of Irma Stern, for example, it's only one side of this whole discussion that so often gets put forward, and not necessarily the other one. And the other one kind of exists as this undercurrent of people critiquing her because she also is regarded in such a high viewpoint. So within this whole idea of publicness, if this whole conversation was made public or was transparent, you're then kind of able to put forward this artist in a way that people can then have the right to choose how they kind of want to view her. Maybe they don't see it as a problem. Maybe it isn't a problem that necessarily concerns them. But it's this idea of publicness in a way where you kind of then let the viewer, you give the space to the viewer for them to kind of discern where they kind of want to go. And the exact same, I think, kind of sits with Mthethwa as well.
I'm thinking about that's an ethical dilemma in itself, of the line a curator would tread in order to make sure that what they're showing is unbiased in that sense, because in many cases there's like an educational aspect of curatorship, but there's also, and they have their own biases, but then to present it in a way that allows the viewer to view it how they want to, then you don't have control over that anymore. It's an interesting dilemma to face. I'm not sure if we can bring Dwayne into the conversation. I see your hand in our chat, but technically I'm not sure we can do that. But let me see if there's another question here on the tool. Okay, nothing specifically about the ethical dilemma, but one thing I think we also talked about was whose voices are being highlighted here, especially if the decision to show that artwork in that specific exhibition was supposed to be about violence against women and sex workers. But then the art of someone who was violent in that regard was shown. Whose voice really does that show? Something you were talking about as well. Any other comments you'd like to share from your side, Seth and Vonnie?
One thing from what you've just said, it is really interesting. And what I found even more interesting about Mthethwa's work that was shown was it was also an unnamed sitter. So even in the context of the exhibition and what they were trying to achieve, it still doesn't connect with the particular image, even if we take Mthethwa out of the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, and also to Nilo and Amanda for the presentation just before. So the next part we would like to share with you is more dialogue between participants in this exchange. We would like to explore these dilemmas a little further, but also reflect on our process up until now. So to do that, I'd like to introduce a few other participants from the exchange. From the University of Cape Town curatorship program, please welcome Kumo Mahano and Katleho Diseko. And from the Federal University of the state of Rio de Janeiro, please welcome Thais Mayumi, who's co-coordinated the exchange on this side, and also, again, Nilo Almeida. Welcome back to the event. Hello, all of you. So, lots has been shared. Maybe you have some comments on the ethical dilemmas, but before we get into that and some of the questions that have been posed on the box art tool, one question I wanted to pose to you was about how our exchange was short and sweet, but there was lots of things that we were able to share with each other in our short time together. So I wonder if you all could share from the different groups some of the key learnings you had from the other side over the last month. Yeah, and please feel free to keep asking questions, everyone that's watching.
Is it okay if I go first?
Please.
Hi, everyone. So basically what I've learned from the Humboldt Forum workshops was, well, in the short space of time, was quite a bit. So through the conversations with our Brazilian contemporaries, one of the things that stood out for me were how manifestos need to be more open to like revision, in the sense that they now, as we know them, currently operate as like a list of strict directives instead of operating as a guidebook, and as well as the necessity for digitization of manifestos. And some other issues such as how both our Brazilian cohorts and Cape Town cohorts have issues that coalesce, such as dealing with historical collections from eras rooted in expansionism, and things such as the ownership of artists' archives, and how we can, bring about change with regards to those issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kateko. Just to give some context to that, I mean, the idea of a manifesto was kind of one of the first concepts that we exchanged on, because some sort of a manifesto came out of earlier conversations that Michael and Dwayne were sharing about in the beginning. And so we kind of started there with what this manifesto says and what this manifesto could do. And then you went on to also explore other types of manifestos, right? Claire, who was the coordinator on the South African side, also provided a lot of examples and went through those. And maybe Kumo, would you like to say a bit about that, or maybe some of your learnings as well from the South African side?
Over a short space of time that we got to interact with each other, I got to learn a lot, and I just maybe wish that this friendship could grow from now until, I don't know, whenever. But I got to learn a lot about ethical dilemmas. For the most part, I think that's the point that stood out for me. I didn't understand. Okay, I knew them, but I didn't understand how they fit into the context of being a curator, and how do we as curators and museologists deal with them. And I think in a short space of time, I got to learn that it is okay to have this view of something, but also it's okay after some time to change your mind about it, that it's not how I thought it was before. So I think for the most part, I like the art world has a lot of ethical dilemmas that I didn't know about. For instance, like the one that just mentioned by my colleagues, Zwelithini Mthethwa. I knew that his work was kind of problematic, but it kind of didn't dawn into me that it was that deep problematic. So I got to learn a lot, and I just wish we could maybe continue to share ideas about ethical dilemmas in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Kumo. And from the Rio side, what are some of the main learnings you feel that you were inspired by during this process?
Maybe I can start, then Nelly can say few more words after. I think that it's good that we are in this workshop called 99 Questions, because the thing for me, it was that when facing ethical dilemmas, we have most questions after that than answers. So, and I realized that sometimes it's easier to discuss what we have to do than actually doing it. that on this process of creating, we have to recognize that curator job, it's a position of power, but not necessarily of controlling all the process. And for facing this, we have to recognize our limits, I think, because when we are discussing this and we were facing all these problems that we can have when discussing decolonization of museums, when discussing how to make museums more representative, we have to recognize that there are so many questions that we cannot answer all of them in a curator process. So we first have to recognize our limits, and probably as our colleagues had already said today, had to be really transparent to our public, to the society, of what are the main issues that we are trying to face in this in this process of creating an exhibition or a collection. And also, I think that it's important to recognize the reality of each museum, because when we are discussing like the museums, it seems like sometimes there's these institution museums, but reality, we are talking about so many types of museums. They can be small, big, local, can be controlled by a huge enterprise or not funded at all, can be a public or private institution. So here in Brazil, for example, we have some, of course, big museums like these enormous museums that are very important to this construction of Brazil's society and culture. But I don't know, I think we have almost 4,000 museums right now in Brazil, but most of them are younger than myself. So most of them are new institutions that are just starting to realize what are their missions, what they are going to do, and many of them are already doing process that are not related to a colonial process. So I think when we are making demands to the museum as society, and also when we are museum workers are responding to these questions or these demands from the society, we have to recognize and make this public. What kinds of institutions we are discussing and what can we do or not in our reality. Sometimes I think in all this discussion that we have this last month, I was thinking that we cannot embrace some, hypocrisy when we are discussing ethical dilemmas, because sometimes we can just go and just invite some people to make some dialogues, and they say, now I'm a decolonial museum, and this is not true. You have to be sincere to the public, and sometimes be sincere with what we can really do, because sometimes we have just few people working with you, we don't have money at all, and you can just solve one problem this time. But so I will not lose track of what I have to do, but I have like these priorities, the things that I'm doing now, and maybe having this utopia of what I want to reach at the end, but I cannot face everything at the same time. This is for just summarize what we discussed. I think this
whites were having so or facing so difficult or violence because the world is changing. Some values are changing. In the process of change, sometimes have the battles or conflicts. It's natural. Maybe it could be more pacific or more based on dialogue, but this is a process too. So
Thank you.
I think the next. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Nilo. Yeah, you mentioned it as well, and Kumo did also earlier about the shifting of ethics, so shifting of situations and ethics. And I think that's something that came up often in our exchange together, is how ethics are not static, and questioning how and why they shift. Yeah, I think I'll come back to that in a moment, but there is a question that is being top rated on the Vox tool, so I must ask it. And it is about hierarchies in museums. As Nilo was just saying, I mean, this is a global issue. These conversations around society and decoloniality and questioning the status quo, I feel, are happening in many, many different spaces. In museums and as curators, that's just one space that it's being questioned. So the question here is, hierarchies in museums need to be broken so that other voices can be heard. Do you think this is possible? And if so, how can we do this? And maybe we don't have an answer to that necessarily, but maybe you can say a bit about these hierarchies that you're seeing that do need to be broken down so that more voices are heard. Would someone like to comment on that?
Maybe not broken, maybe open. I like the word. Yes, because I think we must be more inclusive, more round table, eye level. I remember the manifesto that's this expression, eye level. So I remember when I talk to a child, what do? You down your knees in the eye level, the child talk to it. So we need to do that. And I think as curators, we work with public, with museum staff, with sponsors. If you are in a public institution, if they're public advisors or agencies, so talk to all of them. I think that's the only way. It's a daily basis way, and a resilience process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I like that. Not to break them, but to open them. Okay. Kumo or Katlego, do you have any thoughts on hierarchies that you see? Yeah, Kumo, I see your hand.
I think adding on to what Nilo said, I think it's important to kind of open these hierarchical systems, but also it might be problematic in a sense that how do we then include the whole society maybe into deciding what goes into the museum and what doesn't go into the museum, and also, on the other hand, it could also be the fact that when we as societies, when we see the exhibitions, we view them as the way we perceive them, not the way how the people that put them perceive them. Like, for instance, the issue of SWEAT, that like the organization that protects the rights of sex workers in South Africa, when they wrote the letter to the curators for Zwelethini Mthethwa's work, they responded by saying that the works act as evidence, but then the society does not know that that is an evidence. They only know, they only see the violations that is put into these exhibition spaces. So I don't know, it's kind of a problem, I could say. It's kind of an ongoing problem that if we build up these hierarchies, but it's necessary, also it's not really necessary. Yeah.
Okay. Katlego, do you have anything to add? To add to that.
No, not at the moment.
Okay. But you did say something, Kumo, that that connects to another question maybe that's here. And I think it was about the shifting. Oh no, now my train of thought has left me. Sorry about that. I'm sure it will come back. But there is a question here for, well, I'm sure you can all talk about this, but it is a question from René Lomes, who's a professor of museology in Brazil. The question is it really possible to decolonize museums with a focus only on exhibitions without radical changes in the processes and acquisition and documentation of items from museum collections? Any thoughts on this? Is it really possible?
I think
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's all connected. So the exhibition is a part of the process from the communication of museums. So you must change the way you see the collection first. So after that, how do you process the acquisition, the new works or objects in the collection, and how will you look at your collection, what is already in the collection? So it's an ongoing process, thinking about the researching in the museum, or the
Oh, Nilo, I think we're losing you.
We can make a new exhibition or a colonial approach.
Sorry, Nilo, you were cutting out just a bit there. But I heard that it's about the approach. And I think that is the question. Like, how much does the approach need to change rather than how we ultimately present this work? Because at that point, this whole process behind it has already been done. Thais, Kumo, Katlego, any thoughts on this?
I could add that sometimes it's really nice, this question, because sometimes it's truly what most people, even from the society in general, expects, that these exhibitions, there are the public face of the museum is the most important thing. And so this is important to listen to people, to this process of making exhibitions. But I totally agree with Nilo that doesn't make sense to face just the exhibition without the collections and the heritage that you are holding. So sometimes it's good to take this exhibition process as an opportunity, I think, because you can use this opportunity to bring and to build relations. I think everything goes around this, because when you start to invite people to be part of exhibition and start to make to build a relation with this group or these representatives of a group, you can start a true and very valuable relation that can then helps you and your institution to review what you are what is your object documents. For example, when we are talking about information about collection, what kind of information do you keep? with it. Sometimes for the specialists or for the museum worker, there are some things that are important that for different groups of the society, other different kinds of information are needed to make the exhibit the objects or that heritage makes sense, so I think this is a great question, because is something that we can take as an opportunity to bring and to build stronger relationships to the museum.
Thank you. That connects very well to another question that's here on the Vox tool, a couple of them actually. So I'll try to ask them in combination with one another. But the first one says, comments on something that was said before, that every curatorial decision is an ethical decision. The question and comment here says that that's a very powerful provocation. What does it say about a curator, or what a curator is and what a curator does? And we've commented a bit about that already. So another question that's here is it about curators rewriting history, or rather bringing affected communities and stakeholders into dialogue at various stages of decision-making? Any thoughts on this question? Is it about rewriting history as a curator, or bringing these different groups in?
That's the ethical decision.
That's the ethical decision itself. Kumo, yeah.
Yes.
I think it's about bringing in other people to kind of deal with these issues, because I don't think we as curators, we can only be given this role. It's a big role. I don't think we cannot handle it as our own. I think we need to include other stakeholders, that like ethical dilemmas, the people, what are the people saying? And yeah, pretty much that's what I think should happen.
Nice, thank you. It also connects to a question I had planned before as well, about whether your concept of a curator has shifted during this exchange. Like maybe you came into the exchange or to your program with an idea of what a curator is. Could any of you share a bit about how that concept has shifted for you over the last month, or through some of the things you've been discussing here?
Well, what I've learned is that there should be a push towards, well, as new curators, I think we should all push towards not looking at the community as just bystanders, and or like involuntary participants, and try to include them as much as possible. Because I honestly believe that the art is just as much ours as it is theirs. And yeah.
Yeah, that's a big learning, I think. And at least for me, engaging with museums has always been something that I go and see, not something that I was part of before. But if it's possible to shift that in some way, how powerful that could be. Any other thoughts on the shifting idea of curatorship from others?
For me, it was a great opportunity. I think this exchange in a south-to-south collaboration, and to hear a little bit from the museum field reality in South Africa, because sometimes this colonial process that all of us are part of makes us to sometimes embrace some ethical dilemmas that are more related to colonial countries than from our reality from colonized countries. So it's important to think about that and to reflect that sometimes when it's about our references, what kind of texts, what kind of museum workers, professionals that we know, and we know their reality, we know the problems, sometimes are all from North America or Europe, and this can also influence our decisions and our ways of thinking and to facing these problems, and sometimes facing problems that are not truly part of our reality. So it was really nice to have this opportunity to rethink a little bit and try to be more aware of what are the main problems that we should face it, and how to make priorities when starting a process in a curatorial level.
Thank you, Thais. Kumo, some thoughts on that?
I think the concept of being a curator, like over time, I got to learn that it's an ever-evolving one. You don't get to grasp what it really entails, because at one point you think that I'm just taking care of the museum collection, but then at some point you're like, I'm dealing with ethical dilemmas. And then continuing forward, it's just like you're dealing with the public. You're trying to, liquidize the hierarchies that exist between these institutions. So it's just like, I don't know, every time when I think about it, I think about the concept of a curator, I come up with a new meaning to it. So I don't think there's really a tangible maybe definition of it. Maybe Google has it, but as we discuss it further, it just gets more and more broader every minute. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. I think that's important to think that it doesn't need to be static, just like ethics are not. At least that's what I've learned in my time with you all as well. Katlego, did you still have a point? I saw your hand quickly.
No, I just felt like, I don't know, art institutions should make a bigger effort to think about like who their constituents truly are, and if they're not being, and consider whether they're being, myopic, or if there's a bigger picture of individuals they're not considering. And I also think being a curator just involves operating with like a huge sense of cultural sensitivity, I don't think you can just walk in a room and pick out that this goes there without considering what the temperature is in the room, and like how important the information we're dealing with is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. So there's two more questions that I'd like to pose to you all before we come to a close. And I remembered what I wanted to ask about what Kumo was saying before. It was about the relationship of museums to society. And when I was originally asked to join this process with you, the working title was Museums and Society, questioning how connected those two were. And ultimately that is what's come out in our conversations as well. But in thinking of who is the driving force behind change in museums, that was one of the starting questions we had. Does it come from museums, or does it come from a critical society? And especially thinking about the more mainstream topics of restitution and whatnot, a lot of that has come out through a critical society. And correct me if I'm wrong. But so one of the questions here on the Vox tool is, can museums, a type of cultural institution developed in the heydays of colonialism, be changed from the inside? Or does it need new forms of institutions not structurally afflicted by coloniality, or I guess critical society as well? What are your thoughts on that? How can a museum be changed? Can it be changed from the inside?
For me, the answer
I think
is
it's movement from
yes.
both sides, from inside and from the outside.
From both sides. I mean, I guess that's an interesting question to pose to a group of people who work in museums, right? So obviously it can, if you're willing to be here questioning what the mainstream.
I think we have to believe in change, because if not, what's the point of in everything that we are doing, But I also believe that we have to support and help maybe other kinds of institutions that raise from this kind of process in moments in history, because it's sure that we can learn a lot from different kinds of structure or institutions and process related to heritage, memory, and culture. And so I think that we have to have both. I believe in museum diversity. I think that having different kinds of institutions is the best for us, because we can learn a lot from institutions that are constructed and raised in different kinds of contexts. And I think this is a good way or a path to follow to change these older and more traditional structures.
Thanks, Thais. Any additions from the Cape Town side? Yeah, Kumo.
I think the idea of changing museums, museums, I think from my side, I view them, they always have some colonial history attached to them. I don't know if it's just me, but oftentimes when you hear the word museum, you're just thinking about the Asian art and all the art that you cannot find in the contemporary art world. But I believe we can be able to change them, provided that they start changing within them. Like if we change the rules, if we change how we view them, I feel like there is like a space for change. But that change is not, it's just more or less like the concept of decolonization. It's not like an overnight change. It's like a process. So we cannot just wake up and say, no, we have a new museum and we have a new way of viewing museums. So I feel like by also including these ethical dilemmas into the museum spaces, then we are gradually moving towards changing the idea of museums. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Katlego.
Just to add on to what Kumo said, I think change can come from inside and outside, but I think if you're operating from the inside, just as an institution, I think there needs to be like a brutal honesty about your shortcomings, as well as what like the people who invested in your organization or institution, what are their needs? What are their interests? What really drives them to do what they do? And does it really relate to what the people are looking to, or the changes that people are looking to see?
That is a very good point, and very nicely connected to the last question I'd like to pose to you all. It was also asked here in the tool and connects to a lot of what we've talked about, which is that curatorship must involve society. Museums must involve society. They must be places that reflect the desires and perspectives that are present in our various societies. So, what are the elements or practices of this roundtable idea that was proposed before, and also toward relational ethics? that both of these groups have spoken about? And do you think that they can be transported across contexts, or are they very much context specific? So again, what are the elements of these sort of roundtables and bringing people together to achieve some of the things we've been talking about? And can they be transnational in that sense, or trans-contextual? And I guess I would give it to Rio first, and then to Cape Town. Any thoughts on this?
There was something that I realized that it's like almost a global problem. That is these labor relations in the museums, because sometimes we discuss it about how can people inside the museums or collaborators to the museums can say what they think and try to build change without being having fear, because if you have like a work relation with this institution, and depending on how this relation is, you need that job, and sometimes you don't want to make some troubles because you don't want to lose that job. And so I realized in our exchange, this is a big issue, that we have to face this. We have to face that sometimes in our systems, the labor relations are not fair to everyone. So how these institutions that have these structures that sometimes people have temporary jobs, they're just collaborating, and how they are just hired for work for a period of time, and how we can guarantee that they are free to put their expressions and what in their thoughts, and to be part of a real change if they have this weak relation, like labor relation. So I realized this is a big thing, and there here in Brazil, but also in South Africa and probably everywhere.
Mm-hmm. So the ability to do long-term change if your contract is only temporary and you're brought in for a specific project. Thank you, Thais. Nilo, anything to add to that from the Rio context?
I think the curator is a researcher. So when you think about the round table, it's what you can talk about in the round table. Even how can you deal with the collection with your peers? How can you deal with the community about the collection or the exhibition? I was remembering now the Historical Museum in Rio. They have a long-term exhibition, and they add some new objects, and they're reviewing with, if I'm not mistaken, indigenous people, and they invite them to talk about the exhibition and review the exhibition. So that's, for example, a kind of roundtable practice. So it's I think the challenge for the curator is how can you are able inside the institution, even if it's a long-term work or a specific work, how can you make this practice? How much space do you have to do that?
Thank you. And Kumo and Kefego, any thoughts from your side on how a roundtable like this could be set up, or what elements of it are necessary?
I think for me, it's about relational engagement more so, because I feel like maybe adding on to what Milo said, like engagement of just maybe not one subject matter, into these issues, but maybe including other stakeholders, if I could call them that, into kind of discussing these issues beforehand, before like maybe exhibitions that are problematic or any of that, because I feel like it's important to kind of maybe include the society in as much as we don't want to do that. I think it's important to do that because the way we as academics view these issues, it's not the same as another person from the society can be able to, I don't know, view them or perceive them. So yeah, I think it's important also adding on to opening up the hierarchical standards within museums and galleries. Thank you.
Thank you, Kumo. Anything you'd like to add, Katlego?
Well, I think roundtables at some level can be guilty of pandering, but I do think there needs to be an interest in who is taking part in them. Like, and I don't think they should exclusively consider the academic community and just allow for a broader perspective. I think other people should be considered as well.
Yeah, thank you. I can only relate from my context of community building and environmental policy and intersectional organizing, which again it takes a lot of time, as we were saying before, time and genuine relationships and actually going out and being in places instead of inviting people into a space you've already created. We can talk about it for a very long time, but I think a lot of these learnings on how decoloniality is practiced in different sectors, whether it be in the curation of exhibitions and at museums or in the development of environmental justice initiatives, I think it always takes this element of time and relationship building so that all of these different perspectives can be included and that the mainstream status quo can be challenged. So I thank you all for your insights onto this. Kumo, Katlego, Thais, Nilo, thank you so much. Also to all of the other participants of the exchange. Again, it's been my pleasure to meet you all and be part of this process with you. So we thank everyone for being here and listening to what has come out of this wonderful exchange. That's all we have for the evening. And a big thank you again to all the participants, to the coordinators of the exchange, Dwayne and Claire from Cape Town, Thais and Paolo from Rio, Michael for initiating, also again, our tech team behind all of this, making it run smoothly. Thank you so much. This also wrapped up the first round of 99 questions for this year. So we'll be taking a short summer break and be back soon with more very intriguing, interesting dialogues. So stay tuned. But for now, thank you again for joining and have a beautiful evening. We'll see you here again soon.